Good morning. Today is the 6th day of Cheshvan, the 19th of Kislev, the 19th of November. Yeah. And we're continuing with our second installment of Tzitzit from Derech Mitzvotecha. Uviul zeh. So, first time we just read basically what it says in Kabbalah about Tzitzit, and now he's going to start explaining what this all means. And the explanation of all of this, what we read from Kabbalah, to understand the allegories and the riddles of the sages. And why did they do this? They did this because, as we'll see today, hopefully we'll get to it, there's a good reason to keep these things secret. We'll talk about it. And secret at least at the level that not everybody can understand if you're not well versed in the vernacular of this type of speech. And so it says, "Yesh להקדים מאמר הז"ל המפליגים בעניין מצוות ציצית." So first of all, we need to quote the language of the sages who exalt the importance of tzitzis. והוא אמרם ז"ל, and they said in the 4th chapter of Menachos, on the verse, "Uritem oto uschatem et kol mitzvot Hashem," you shall see it, meaning the tzitzis that is hanging out, and you will remember all the commandments of God. Shkula mitzvah zu keneged kol mitzvot kulan. This, right. So this mitzvah is equally weighted as all the mitzvahs. Now here I put in a note, and I have to tell you, I don't know where I got this. I don't remember where I got this from. It's an earthquake, if it's true. I don't think I had a revelation. I must have read it somewhere. But I didn't write where I read it from. Well, maybe you told me. בכל מקום שכתוב ששקול כנגד הכל, I see how. Okay, I understand now how it works. When it says that something is equally weighted as everything, kol mitzvot kulan, what do we mean by kol mitzvot kulan? What does it even mean? How can you say that? Something is equally weighted to all the commandments. What do you mean? There's so many commandments, how can I do it? So the meaning is, because it says kol mitzvot kulan, the word kol always has a certain meaning. Kol, all, has a meaning in Hebrew. הכוונה ששקול כנגד כל מה שהייתה השכינה בבית המקדש. The kol here is the divine presence. In other words, what it's trying to say is the sages were against weighing the mitzvahs one against the others, to say something is equal to everything else. When they say it about Talmud Torah, that everything is equal to Talmud Torah, what do they mean? They mean all the or pnimi that you might get from all the mitzvahs is equal to what you will get from Torah. In other words, the other mitzvahs have little or none of the or pnimi, of the inner light that integrates into you. And when you learn Torah, you get all the inner light. So if you learn Torah, it's like you performed everything else in terms of the or pnimi. You can't say, you always have to limit it in some way. You have to say, so what are we talking about? Baruch haba.
The call comes to limit here, correct?
Kol can't mean totality.
Yeah, right.
It's saying something. So what is this kol? So the kol in the case of learning Torah is the or pnimi, is the inner light. The kol in case of the tzitzis is what the Shechina, what the divine presence gave during the time of the Beis HaMikdash. So you get all of that divine presence from this mitzvah. It's not saying that it's instead of all these other mitzvot. It's nothing like that. It's equal in some way, right? It's equally weighted in some way, not in every single possible way. Okay. ופירוש רש"י מדכתיב את כל מצוות ועוד. And what Rashi explained about this is that tzitzis in its gematria is 600. Now we talked about this once, if you remember. Tzitzis is not equal to 600. A little bit of problem. It's equal to 590. Why? Because the Torah never writes it tzadik yud taf. To be 600, it would have to be tzadik yud taf. And the Torah never writes it that way. It writes it tzadik yud taf. So you're short 10. So what do you do? So where did Rashi get this? As the Rashi could say, but if you would write it correctly, not the way the Torah did, it would be Tzadik Yud Taf. So Rav Ginsburg explained it very simply. He said that it shows up 3 times. It says ציצית, ציצית, לציצית. It says, twice it says Tzadik Yud Taf, and one time it says Lamed Tzadik Yud Taf. So if you take all 3 together, what do you get? 1800. Because we said they're missing 10, and then in the last one you have 30 extra. So you have minus 20, and then you have 30 extra, so it comes out to 1800. So the average value is 600. This is a very nice thing just to mention this.
Good for a
And
mathematician.
then Chamisha Ksharim, there are 5 double knots that we put in each tzitzis, and 8 threads. So altogether, we have 613. 600 plus 5 plus 8. So that's what Rashi says about it. V'tanya yidach, u'item oto u'schartem, riyah mevi'ah lidei schira. And the other Tana, the other Braita we have there in Menachos, in the 4th chapter, is that when you see it, you will remember. Seeing brings about remembrance. It's also a big question. What do you mean? How can seeing a tzitzis make me remember everything? So what is that? So he's saying we have to understand all these statements.
Blue, and the blue is the sky, and when you look at the sky, you remember it.
בסדר, we have to understand. ולהבין זה למה בחר במצווה זו להיות על ידה דווקא זיכרון כל המצוות. He's not saying you'll remember Hashem. He says you remember all the mitzvot. And to understand why it is specifically this mitzvah through which the remembrance of all the mitzvot comes, that also we need to understand. V'yotash kula keneged kulam. What does it mean? That it's equally weighted as all of them. So to understand all of this, tzarich le'agdim tchila shalosh hakdamot. So to understand all of these topics, we have a ways to go, right? It's going to take us time. So we have to understand, first of all, 3 introductions. 3 introductions that are general introductions, but they're going to be very particularly essential here. הראשון הוא ביאור עניין מעלת התורה והמצוות, אשר בשלם ירדן שמה מקום מעלתה, בעודה עומד לפני השם, מתענג בהשגתה והזיו כבודו, כאחד מן השכלים הנבדלים, ותרד בגוף חומרים מלא תאוות גשמיות, לקיים מצוות ומעשיות, ומות תורת השם מדברת מעניינים גשמיים, כפאה ותרומה, מסורות וציצית מצמר. General question, why is the soul that is such a spiritual and high thing?
Why is the what?
The soul, which is a high and spiritual thing. What does it mean? What is the soul in essence? It's a part of God. Which part of God is it? Let's say which part are you talking about? So he says it's a part that contemplates God. It's a part that experiences God. It's almost like within God himself there's something that experiences him. And so it experiences him. Why did it come down here to experience the physical world? What good is that? How is that better than being with God himself? What did it gain from coming down into this physical body that's full of so many physical cravings? And all of this in order to do what? To perform mitzvahs, to perform God's commandments. Why is that so important? How could that be so much better than contemplating godliness? But again, you have to understand this. The soul is not the part that, I don't know. You have to think about, what does it mean the soul is part of God? What does that even mean? So we say that it's the representation of the part of God that, as it were, is experiencing him. Let's take it in a human being. What part of us experiences ourselves? It's not my hand, and it's not my foot. It's not my power of walking, my power of, writing, let's say. What is it? So what is it?
It's your conscience.
Something about, and not all my consciousness, because a lot of my consciousness is about the outside.
Yeah, right.
It's something very, very unique that is a very, very small part of who I am, but it's very critical, because otherwise, theoretically, I wouldn't know myself. I wouldn't be able to function, because we are all self-reflective.
That's right.
That's what makes us into human beings. And so, that part is self-reflection, the ability to know myself. That's why it says that the soul is usually associated with dat. Like if we had to say, what is the soul among the Sfirot, we would say the core of it is self-reflection, is dat, muda'ut, consciousness, but specifically the ability to be conscious of myself. What does that lead to? It leads to a very interesting observation. That a person who has no self-reflection doesn't have a soul yet. Meaning, it's the power of self-reflection. So let's say I look at a person, and I see that he is completely oblivious to his own existence. In other words, he's living, he eats, he drinks.
You mean it's like a psychopath?
Could be a psychopath,
Okay.
but I'm not talking about a psychopath.
You're not.
I'm talking about somebody who's so undeveloped.
He's existing.
He's here. He doesn't. He could even be a very, to a certain extent, useful part of reality. He's a bureaucrat in some office. He's not a psychopath. He's normal, completely normal. But because he has no powers of self-recognition, he's not developing. The way a person develops is because he becomes conscious of himself. And he begins to say, well, the way I am right now is not so good. I would like to be better. I would like to improve myself. There are people who don't think that way. They don't see that at all. Or at least they don't, again, they have no representation of the self. They don't see themselves at all.
Okay.
So, this is a very important observation about the soul. And so we say that we're not allowed to have mercy, to have compassion on someone who has no dot. Why? Because when you show him compassion, what are you doing? He's thinking,
Acknowledging, in a sense, correct.
well, if I'm showing someone who has no self-reflection, compassion,
Yeah.
they won't understand it as compassion. What will they understand it as? They'll understand it as the world is bowing down to them in some way. They won't understand that I went through some kind of inner deliberation, because compassion requires an inner reflective process. That really I should have acted this way towards you. Now I'm acting in a different way towards you. So what do they understand? That the world is bowing down to them. This is so pertinent to our situation with the Hamas. Exactly, and not just them, all the Amalekites in the world. They have no conception that what you're doing is a reflective process. What they understand is that you're weak. They understand the world is bowing down to you. And so Chazal say, do not act with compassion towards those who have no self-reflection, because they can't even understand what you're doing. So they're not advancing, they're not moving forward, they're not developing, and they also can't understand what a normal human being is going through if they act with kindness towards them. What they understand is that they're weak and that they have more power than them. That's how they see it. Again, because they can't recognize themselves in what's going on. So that was the side point. The main point is that the soul is the part of God, is a word that is aware of itself. And so I become aware of God. It's aware of God, and it's also, when it comes down into the body, becomes aware of itself. וכבר דיברנו מזה במצווה הראשונה, וכאן נוסיף לך ביאור קצת ודברי תורה עניים במקום אחד ועשירים במקום אחר. So we talked about this in the first mitzvah, which we skipped. We'll go back to it, God willing, in a few weeks when we finish this. I just felt like I had to prepare it some more, the mitzvah to be fertile, to have children. I felt I needed to prepare it more before we delve into it, because it's one of the hardest ones. So he says, I talked about it there, and words of Torah are meager in one place, they're rich and ample in other places. You have to learn from one place to another, very simple. The second, להבין ולהשכיל בעניין השכר והעונש. A person has to understand, a second introduction here is to understand the concept of reward. I added punishment, but it's just because that's how people say it, reward and punishment. Really, he only wants to talk about reward. והיא הטובה שתגיע לאדם בעשיית המצוות שציוונו בהם על ידי משה רבנו עליו השלום. And this is the goodness that a person will attain by performing the commandments given to us by Moshe Rabbeinu. והם שני מינים. And there are two types of reward. Rishon, hu Gan Eden. The first one is Gan Eden. We'll see what that is in a second. The second one, the Garden of Eden. The second is Tchiat HaMetim b'imra b'yameinu. The second one is the resurrection of the dead, speedily in our days. Now, הרמב"ם בפירוש המשנות במשנת כל ישראל, יש להם חלק לעולם הבא, העריך בביאור עניין עולם הבא. So Maimonides, he explains in his commentary in the Mishnah, what is this world to come? This is the first time he's mentioning this. He says there's a concept in Chazal called Olam Haba, the world to come. And the Rambam says, what is this world to come? She'ledato zehu Gan Eden. He says the world to come is what we call the Garden of Eden. So he says these are interchangeable terms. Where did the word Gan Eden come from? That came from Torah. Why did they change it into Olam Haba? They do this for many words, many things. In any case, what are they trying to say? That you, when you read the Torah, you thought that Gan Eden was something in the past. Now we're telling you that Gan Eden is also something in the future. Meaning you came from there, you'll go to there. וזה לשונו בקיצור, כי כמו שלא ישיג הסומה אין הצבעים ולא החרש שמע הקולות. Just as a person who's blind cannot perceive, cannot understand, not just perceive is like the sense, he cannot fathom what colors are, and the person who is deaf cannot understand, cannot comprehend what sounds are. כן לא ישיגו הגופות התענוגים הנפשיות שהם תמידים ועומדים לעד ואין נפסקים. So, material bodies cannot understand the pleasure that comes from the spiritual, the soul, things that are eternal, stand forever, and never end. And there is no connection at all between them and what we call material pleasures. So that's what the soul perceives. And what he's referring to, what I'm referring to, says the Rambam, is what a person perceives with the soul in Gan Eden from the Creator. That is a pleasure that the material body cannot fathom. And given that type of perception, when they perceive this, when they encounter this pleasure of perceiving God, it is a pleasure that is infinite, it never ends, as opposed to our pleasure, the pleasures that we have in the material body, which are always limited. You cannot continue to have pleasure forever. By the way, that is a statement, as far as I know, only from the Baal Shem Tov, and he didn't take it from Chazal anywhere that I know. There's a whole idea from him that physical pleasure is always limited. It cannot be continuous. So if you eat ice cream, you perceive the pleasure at the moment that your tongue touches the ice cream. It does not continue after that. You have to stop eating, then you touch the ice cream again, you get the pleasure again. But you can't have it continuously. There's no way to make it continuous. In any case, and this is what we call, says the Rambam, Olam Haba, the world to come, where our souls will become cognizant and comprehensive of knowing God. That's what we just said about the soul. The soul is the part that knows God. And you can't divide this pleasure into parts. It cannot be enumerated, it's without end. And there's no parable to explain this to the material existence. Meaning we, in our material existence right now, cannot understand this type of pleasure. But rather, as the prophet said, how great, said the prophet, is the goodness that you have sequestered for those who fear you. And that is the tachlis. That is the goal of all of life, to reach that state. Okay? That's how the Rambam explains this. What is this Gan Eden? What is Olam Haba? He says it's the same thing. It's where the soul goes after the person departs from the body. What is Tchias HaMeisim then, says the Rambam? What is this resurrection of the dead? ודע כי אדם יש לו למות בהכרח ויתפרד וישוב למה שהוקם ממנו עד כאן לשונו. And you should know that man also has a material side to him, and the material side is made out of what they call the four elements, and this will eventually break apart when he passes away, and it will return to its basic constituents, the different elements. ורוצה לומר, so he cut this short, he said, עד כאן לשונו. This is what he said there. ורוצה לומר, כי תחיית המתים ולפי שעה. And what he wants to say is that Tchias HaMeisim, the resurrection of the dead, is a temporary status, meaning you are resurrected for a temporary amount of time. And after that, you die again, you pass away again, and then you go back to Gan Eden. The soul goes back to Gan Eden. The material is finished. We don't need it anymore. It doesn't exist anymore. And everything there...
So what do we need?
He says, not here he didn't say it, but he says in other places that that's how God gives the reward. It says in Chazal that he has to give the reward, some of the reward, to the body also. So for the body to receive a reward, he has to come back to life. Okay. וביאור זה גם כן יותר באיגרת התחייה שלו יעוין שם. So he says, it's explained more in length in another source from the Rambam. אבל הרמב"ן נחלק עליו בראיות ברורות. But Nachmanides, Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman, he disputed this with good proofs, ראיות ברורות. אמרו חז"ל צדיקים אינן חוזרים להפרם, because it says in Sanhedrin that once the resurrection happens, the tzaddikim don't go back to not having a body. They continue to have a body forever. How do we know this forever? Because it has to continue the state that they had as a soul. And then says Nachmanides, Olam Haba is not only Gan Eden, it's also the world of the resurrection, and there the world of the resurrection, it is the final goal. It's where you're aiming at. That's the purpose of all of creation.
So the physicality
has to exist. Right, continues. והגן עדן שהוא תענוג הנפשות ושכלים נבדלים, אם אומנם אמת שמעתו נכבדת עד מאוד, and Gan Eden, even, again, the world of the souls, let's call it, after the person departs from this world, even though it is a great pleasure, it is a pleasure of the intellect, the pleasure of the mind, of the soul, and it's spiritual pleasure, and it's very great, still, it's not as great as, and it's not the purpose which is the world of the resurrection. So he says it's the Garden of Eden, the world of the souls, that is temporary, not this physical world. עד זמן התחייה של העולם הבא, שדבת העולם הבא שהוא התחייה עודפת עליו לאין קץ ותחליף בעניין התענוג בגילוי אלוקותו יתברך. וכן הוא האמת על פי קבלה, and says in Kabbalah, paskin like Nachmanides, that the goal is Olam Haba, which means the world of resurrection, not Olam Haba, the world of souls after a person departs. ולכאורה אינו מובן איך יהיה התענוג לנשמה כשהיא בגוף יותר מעולה ונכבד מן התענוג לנפש מופשטת מן החומר, שהרי מעלת הרוחניות יותר שלם מהגשמיות כנודע. It says, but this presents that spiritual pleasure would be greater than physical pleasure. Sorry, I said exactly the opposite. How could physical pleasure somehow be greater than spiritual pleasure? Because spiritual pleasure is knowing God directly, and because of the body we have limitations on our knowledge. Like you said, the body can't understand even something that is infinite, something that, and so on. There's no real connection to this infinite aspect, this limitless aspect of godliness. So how can it perceive it? So how could that be the purpose? So what's going on here? So he says this is a real dilemma. On the one hand, Nachmanides, he's the Kabbalistic tradition, and that's how Chasidut and Kabbalah paskin on this, they rule on this. On the other hand, the Rambam, Maimonides, who's the philosophical tradition, seems to be much more logical. So how do you solve this problem? That we'll talk about next time. Some of it next time, not all of it. It's going to take a little bit more. And I was hoping that we would talk more about the repercussions, because we wanted to talk about, we already mentioned that something that doesn't have self-reflection doesn't have a soul. So we'll have to delay that to tomorrow, God willing.